golf fans, it's your boy Gsluke here with our weekly course breakdown. This time we've got the President's Cup, some team golf, Team USA versus the international squad. Not quite the Ryder Cup, but still an exciting event to watch from the fan perspective. We get a different format than what we're used to seeing week to week, and Quail Hollow Club, the venue for this week, is an absolute gem. In this video, going to cover what to expect from Quail Hollow. We'll talk about the setup, we'll talk about each hole, actually go hole by hole, show you some of the strategy and shots involved around this venue. And then at the end, talk about who I expect to go out there and shine from a course fit perspective, also some of the comp courses around the tour that I think play similar to a Quail Hollow. You'll be an expert by the end and equipped to go out there and research for your DFS and your outright bets. There's the points leader for each team, points leader overall. You can choose the international or USA squad, and then DFS on Draftkings. They've got themselves a captain mode showdown sort of slate going on too. So it's exciting, a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and hop on in. Quail Hollow Club up there in Charlotte, North Carolina, a gem of a town, and this course is an absolute beauty. It's a Parkland style course that per the GCSAA is only going to play at 7,047 yards, but don't buy that. This is a 7,600 yard golf course. It is a big boys type of track. You go out there, you lash it driver as far as humanly possible, and you've seen a lot of the primo elite tier bombers over the years have success here. First off, I was there at the last Wells Fargo, at least the one that was held at the Quail Hollow Club, where Rory McIlroy ended up winning. The year before that, I was there as well. And there's a clear bias on distance. You have the 7,600 yard golf course, which for par 71 is exceptionally long, but you also have a lot of elevation changes. Most of the downhill holes tend to be short par fours, also par threes, where that advantage kind of is non-existent because it's already short to begin with. The par threes, for example, they're 200 yard par threes downhill, so they're still going to be playing like 170, 180 yards. And if anything, clubbing is a little bit more difficult on those holes, much like a Kapalua that they play for the Century Tournament of Champions. There's a lot of creativity that goes into hitting every single golf shot. A lot of the holes that play uphill, you're going to be dealing with blind golf shots into greens. A lot of the fairways here are tilted in one direction or the other, have undulation, also like a Kapalua, which we're going to talk about at the end in terms of a comp course, but also an Augusta National. So this course is a perfect venue for a President's Cup, a match play sort of format where the United States wants to cater the course in the venue to their skill set, to what should make them a little bit more successful in this President's Cup. And of course, the venue, they want to choose a top tier one that's beautiful. Quail Hollow checks that emphatically, but more importantly, one that is strategically advantageous for the team. And that's what you get here. So from a top level perspective, this is a long bomber sort of golf course. In fact, the GCSAA made that even more so clear to us as they let us know that it's not overseeded this time of year here in September. So you're dealing with a little bit less penal rough. It's not quite as dense as what you'd get over there in May, and they usually play the Wells Fargo Championship. And they said, per their own words, that is going to make that long bombers, players that miss a little bit further left to right off the tee, the guys that you want to target. It said that it's advantageous. It's not going to be nearly as dense out there. And as a result, that effect that we see in May for the Wells Fargo Championship is only going to be further more so the case here for the President's Cup. So, minus 700 favorites for the United States. While it's a lot of juice to lay, I think it's right about a perfect line. So I wouldn't bet it either way, but just know that the United States are going to be huge favorites here, and that is likely the reason why. This is a George Cobb design out there in 1966. It was last redesigned by Tom Fazio in the 2000s. It's happened a few times with Fazio over the last few years. It's much more a Fazio design at this point than it is a Cobb design back in the 1960s. He's had a lot of hands on this golf course. He's renovated, added a lot of bunkers to the property. He's added length. That's the one major effect that Fazio's had on this venue. And the greens have gone a little bit more tricky as well. So it's gone from being, I'd say, back in its early stages, one of the easier courses that you'd probably play in the area, to at this point probably the most difficult course there in the North Carolina area. So it's a definite test It's what you'd like to see for a match play format, like I mentioned, also here for a President's Cup style event. And the greens are right about tour average. So if we look at the greens specifically, they're not too large, they're not too small. They're 6,578 square foot per green. They'll be running at right around 11.5, and they are Bermuda grass. So champion Bermuda grass, what you're used to seeing in this part of the country, especially down there in South Florida this time of year, is resilient in the sun and is going to play with a lot of grain. It's the sort of green surface that on TV you'll see a lot of dark spots, a lot of light spots, which is really going to help players with making their reads. But if you're not used to playing on Bermuda, you can get exposed because reading greens, if you're not used to that, can be exceptionally difficult. But for somebody like myself that's from South Florida, I think it's advantageous. So we're definitely looking at Bermuda grass specialists, the guys that are used to playing on the surface. Should expect to putt a little bit better this week on average. Looking at the fairways, they're about 20 to 30 yards wide. We don't have the data from this year because the Wells Fargo was played at a different golf course, TPC Avenel Farm, but they're 25 to 30 yards wide year to year, and they're also Bermuda. And the rough is Bermuda, it's only 1.75 inches. So you're dealing with little to no rough. It's also not overseeded like you have early in the year. So you're looking at little to no penalty for missing fairways. The only penalty you walk into, and I can just tell you as somebody that's been there in person, are the trees. It's heavily wooded. There's not really a lot of low-hanging limbs. It's a lot of really tall trees that have been there for a long time. So it's not really the leaves and the branches that you have to worry about. It's just that there's so many tree trunks there when you're off into that wooded chip area that sometimes you're going to have to shape a shot to get out of it, and there's no guarantee that you're going to miss the trees, right? You can deflect off of something. You're going to see a lot of players that are just chipping out sideways out of the trees because you don't really, unless you just go for the hero shot, don't really have a shot out of there all too often. So there's a penalty for missing wildly off the tee, but if you're just going to be in the rough, if you're missing by something like 10 to 15 yards, you're not going to have a problem here, particularly if one of those bombers, and if it's playing 7,000 yards, I don't want to say it'll be a joke, but the United States are going to have wedge into almost every single hole, but 7,600 yards is where you're going to see the separation in the field. So when we go hole by hole here, we're going to take a look at the actual golf course, like the one that is more than likely going to be in play. This 7,047 yards mark that we talked about a little bit earlier, I think is maybe a little bit of deception from the Davis Love side there. Throwing a little bit of a curveball at Trevor Immelman, maybe giving him some hope, hoping that it'll be a shorter course. This tipped out is 7,600 yards, if not closer to 7,700 yards, and I fully expect it to play that length. All right, we've got Pro Visualizer up, and it's time to go hole by hole to give you an idea of what this track is all about. So hole 1 is a 520-yard par 4, so not quite the handshake that most players are looking for. This fairway bunker to the left is going to get a lot of attention, especially this time of year where the fairways are going to be even firmer and faster than what we have for the usual Wells Fargo, so expect that to get a lot of usage. And the fairway bunkers to the left here, to the right, pretty much anything but the green is a common target on hole number 1. So not nearly a handshake like you'd see at most golf courses, is extremely difficult. Hole 2 is actually a little easier, so it plays relatively flat just like hole 1. You're not going to see a ton of elevation change here on the first 2 holes, but it's 460 yards. You do have quite a dense wooded area to the right. The green is out in the open. It's not protected by a lot of bunkering. So hole number 2 is a spot where you can get back a birdie if you end up giving back a shot on number 1, but still 460 yards. It's not a gimme by any means, right? You're looking at a healthy par 4. Hole 3 is 419 yards, so just 1 yard shorter than what you saw there for hole number 1. The fairway bunker to the right will get some action. To the left, it's relatively wide open, so the miss here is to hit it in the left rough. The green is relatively large. It's on the larger end of the spectrum for this golf course. It is well protected in the front, but over the back, you have plenty of room to get up and down, unless you're looking at a back right pin location or even a front right pin location that might be a little bit tricky if you're short-sided there. For most pin locations, this is a relatively benign hole, even though it's over 500 yards, but should, especially for some of the American players, be a spot where you could go out there and steal a point with a birdie, right? Get out there in the fairway 320 yards. It's not nearly as difficult when you're hitting a 160-yard wedge shot. Next up, we've got a 187-yard par 3, also relatively flat. So this is the flat side of the golf course. It's protected in the front. It's relatively narrow. So if it is getting firm and fast, which in general, we talked about the fairways earlier, the green should also be a little bit firmer and faster. Just because of the time of the year, it's a little bit warmer. Everything's evaporated off a little bit more. So expect that hole to maybe play a little bit more difficult than we're used to seeing just because of that effect. Hole 5 is 454 yards, a lot of bunkering here. So if you decide to be a little bit more conservative and you flare it out a little bit, you can end up in that front right bunker. The second set are also a little bit more common. You're going to see a lot more players in those two that are hitting driver. But if you can hit the fairway here, even if you just have to lay up out here with, let's say, like a 3-wood to the left, I mean, you still have like 160, 165 yards at the very most in. This is one of the more scoreable holes that you're going to find out here. So 454, get used to it, right? I mean, that's going to be an easy hole for you out there because next up, this is well downhill. So that hole actually plays uphill too. So I meant to mention that. This plays a solid like 2-3 yards uphill. The next hole plays 5 yards downhill. So even though it is 249 yards, it's going to play a little bit closer to like 240, maybe like 7 to 8 yards less. So if you take a look at the green, it's large, but it's not a massive aircraft carrier size like you saw for hole number 2. It's got the bunker in the front, bunker in the back. If they're playing a back pin location, that back bunker is going to get a lot of usage because of the firm and fast conditions. Also, playing downhill doesn't help with that effect. And a lot of shots are going to end up to the right over here. Little chipping area. It's quite sloped heavily from the green down to a little hollow there on the right side. And that's a really hard spot to get up and down from. So, if I'm going to be there in person, if I end up making that leap, we'll have to see. That'll be a spot that I'm watching. It's a beautiful spot to see the prior hole, hole number 5, and then hole number 6, the par 3. First par 5 is 552, so despite all the par 4s being super long, the par 5 is gettable in 2. If you can hit the fairway here, which is a tough task, it's got severe undulation to it. By the way, the houses over here to the right on this hole are unbelievably beautiful. Something else that adds to the difficulty here is the tee box is elevated like hell. It's like 11, 12 yards uphill, so you're going to be dealing with a little bit harder to hit fairways here, especially if it's firm and fast. But if you can get it here, you're left with 250 yards in, which for every player in the field is more than reachable. The longer players might be able to get it out there like 330, 340 because of the conditions on the fairways. It's going to be a very gettable hole if you can be accurate off the tee. Because if you're not, with this water over here to the right, you're going to be laying up all day. You're not going to be taking it on. You're going to see a lot of people miss way out to the left near the cart path over here, where the fans will be, where I might be if I'm there, and have to worry about that. So it's still a good birdie hole, right? Even if you have to bail out, you still have that 40, 50 yard chip. You're more than likely going to have a good birdie look. Hole 8 is one of the shorter holes on property, so it's 348. It plays flat, so it's not as drivable as some would think, but the longer hitters can get it up there within 20, 30 yards of the green. I saw Rory McIlroy get it up there close a few times. A lot of players are just going to hit 3-wood off the tee and have a flip wedge, so this is the easiest hole on property in my opinion, at least in terms of the par 4s. Hole 9's tough. It plays uphill. It's also 500 yards to begin with. The bunker to the right is almost absolute death because then you're left with 200 yards out of a fairway bunker to a green uphill, which is just nightmare fuel if I've ever seen it. And it's a small green. It's got the bunkering in front like you see on a lot of the green complexes here. Just a tough hole that's uphill. And when you see the back nine and how many holes are going up and downhill, you'll really start to see some of the tricky parts of this golf course. Hole 10 is 600 yards. It plays downhill, so it doesn't play nearly all that distance. If you're an elite level player like Rory, you might be able to sniff this green in too, but most guys are going to end up laying up, particularly if you don't end up hitting the fairway and getting up and down for a birdie. Hole 11 is 470. It's relatively flat, but it does play 4 yards uphill, so in your second shot, it's not a blind shot, but it is visually deceiving because you can't really get all of the true depth perception there. If you miss the fairway in one of the fairway bunkers, it can also be a little bit tricky. It's just no walk in the park, right around 475. That's going to be an average of like 4.2, 4.5 shots. Hole 12 is 454. It's one of the more basic holes that you have out here. It does play downhill, so it will play maybe 7 to 10 yards shorter than the scorecard yardage. But not a real easy birdie look. Still 450 yards. 210-yard par 3. This one's a little bit tricky for sure. Had to keep an eye out for this. There's not much to say here. It's a large green. You got a few greenside bunkers. But hit it on the surface, get down to 2, and you'll be happy. Hole 14 is an absolute hoot. Now, if you're here in person, you're watching this, trying to figure out what holes to watch, Hole 14 is where you want to be. It's a drivable par 4. It plays severely downhill. It also is sloped right towards the green, so it's relatively flat in terms of like the total change here, but everything runs onto this green. And you're going to have plenty of guys, particularly if they move up the tee boxes, which at least for Saturday's round, I believe every time I've been there, they've had an upper tee where it only plays like 290 yards. You're going to see guys hit 3-wood onto this green. So it's a fairly, really fun hole to watch in person. And even if it plays the whole way from the tips, you can still end up getting on the surface. Hole 15 is a par 5, so you have a drivable par 4, and then next up a par 5. So you're going to see a lot of scoring at this point. It's relatively long. It's not easy to reach into because it does play uphill. So it goes downhill to your tee shot and then 9 yards uphill. So one of the bigger elevation changes that you're going to have on property. It's a tough shot to get up there in 2, but if you can do so, it's an easy birdie look. It's a relatively flat green. Next hole is 511 yards. This one plays downhill, so it doesn't play as long as the scorecard yardage, but an extremely difficult to hit fairway and a green that is protected by water. So you can't miss left. A lot of people bail out right into this bunker, which also leaves for a difficult up and down. Hole 17 is another hole with water in play, which to this point, right, you had that one par 5 with water in play. It's not all that prevalent around this course, but when you get to the end, you start to see some of that effect. 224 yards, so really difficult from the tips there. A lot of people are going to bail out to the right, try and get up and down, which, to a front right or a back right pin location can be a very difficult thing to do. It's a good closing stretch, but they're not going to play it this way. So I meant to mention this before. It's going to be a little bit rerouted this time. The final hole is going to be hole 15. So hole 14, the drivable par 4. After that, you have that super long par 5. Those are going to be your last 2 holes. That's how they're having it set up. Hole 18 is 495 uphill. This is a brute because of the drive here. It's really easy to miss left in this creek, but if you get a little bit psyched out here and then flail it out to the right, you're also in this fairway bunker. And then you have a 200-yard shot uphill to a green that's tiny that still has the creek there to the left. And in fact, even when Rory won, he shanked it way over there, right? Almost ended up hitting it into the lake. Had to take a penalty drop just because his lie was so bad and ended up still winning from that point. So it's a very difficult hole, plays uphill. Fairway bunker to the right is going to get a lot of usage. And the green complex is also relatively tricky. So it's a great finishing hole. Won't be the finishing hole for this event. As I mentioned, they are rerouting it, but it'll be at a pivotal time in terms of the event. All right, now that we've seen the course, let's talk through my key stats for analysis. At number 1, we've got driving distance, which you could probably tell from the length of the course. But when you look at data golf, any correlations for the Wells Fargo Championship, that's exactly what bubbles to the top. So from the data perspective, also from the eye test, checks both of those emphatically, which makes it something I'm willing to rock with at number 1. Number 2, we've got shots gained putting on Bermuda, which has been important around the Wells Fargo Championship, but more importantly for the match play format. So this is where that's starting to rear its ugly head. Anytime you've got match play, it's the ultimate equalizer. When you hit an approach shot outside of your opponent, you're going to be putting first. And if you can make that 15 to 20 foot putt, you put an immense amount of pressure on your opponent who might still have an 8 to maybe 15 foot putt, and that's why they're inside of you, but it's going to be a lot harder to make, and that is extremely hard to quantify. But what we've noticed over the years are players like a Kevin Kisner, also an Ian Poulter, for example, have had a lot of success with any sort of match play format, whether it's alternate shot, best ball, or even a singles match like you've seen for some of the other Ryder Cups, for example. It's an interesting conundrum. So anytime we're playing match play, I'm going to be looking at putting a lot. And this week we have pure Bermuda grass surfaces. Like I mentioned, they tend to be a little bit grainy. You see a lot of guys that have a sustained success on the Bermuda grass surface and guys that have sustained failures on it. So I'm going to take a look at some of the guys that are on the successful end of that range. And then number 3, we've got shots gained approach. So approach play is going to be important every single week. In fact, probably surprising that it's not there at number 1, but still going to be a key factor there. But I guess more importantly, you're looking at some of the longer irons, right? So that 150 to 175, Surely that 175 to 200 and all of the 200 plus yard ranges are going to be a little bit more important this week. And also taking a look at the form coming in. So if somebody played at the Fortinet, great. So Max Homa coming in with the best form we could be looking for. But most specifically, over the last 24 measured rounds, the guys that are hitting the ball the best on approach are going to be worth a few extra looks here. Some other key stats that I'm mixing in would be birdie or better percentage, their team play record, so how they've done in match play events in the past, shots gained at Quail Hollow, shots gained putting over the last 24 rounds, so not just taking a look at Bermuda numbers, which we don't have a massive sample size for over the last 24 rounds, just taking a look at their form coming in, par 5 scoring, taking a look at shots gained at comp courses, which we're going to touch on here in just about 30 seconds. One putt percentage, which is kind of a way to take a look at shots gained putting. One putt percentage is important because of how players can narrow down on it, right? There's guys like Cam Smith that birdie 40% of the time that they hit a green in regulation. His one putt percentage is through the roof. Whereas with a few other players, they might be a little bit more conservative about it, right? Set up a lot of 2-putt pars. But then you have the players that are horrible at hitting greens that just seem to 1-putt everything, right? Whether it's you're getting up and down around the green or for birdie. I'm trying to take the guys that have a high 1-putt percentage because in a team play format, it's all about acquiring points. And if you can steal points from your opponent by getting some of those 1-putts, that's something that I want to go after. So I'm looking at 1-putt percentage and also match play record, which match play record isn't necessarily team play record, right? Team play record could be like a Ryder Cup or President's Cup. Match play record also includes what you see at the WGC match play, right? Over there at Austin Country Club. Very different golf course, different setup, but at the same time, a lot of the factors in play that you're going to see this week. To wrap it up, we're going to cover our comp courses, the sort of venues around the tour that I expect to play like what we're going to see at Quail Hollow this week. And at number 1, we've got the Torrey Pines Golf Course South Course. So what you see over there for the Farmers Insurance Open, one of the more difficult courses that you're going to see on tour, usually a winning score right between like maybe -8 and -16, something right around there. Luke List won the last time out, another player that's had a ton of success at the Wells Fargo Championship. And in fact, even though we have the Bermuda grass greens over here on the East Coast and Poa greens over there at Torrey, I oftentimes use this course as a comp for Torrey Pines. It was one of the reasons that I hit a Luke List outright at Torrey Pines. So no doubt when we get to Wells Fargo, I'm going to start looking at Torrey Pines as one of my comps because there's countless examples of guys that have had success at one course that have also had success at Torrey Pines. And don't be fooled here, right? There is the North and the South course at Torrey. You see the North course for 1 of the 4 rounds there for the Pro-Am, but you're going to see this time is just the South course. It's where they play on Saturday and Sunday. It's the main course that they're playing for 3 out of the 4 rounds there. The one that is nearly 7,700 yards. And I mentioned before, right? It's quoted at just being over 7,000 yards this week. That's kind of BS. I just want to tell you that right now. I mentioned it before. If you glossed over it again, it's going to play a lot closer to 7,600 yards. So it checks the distance box. You're dealing with an approach play specialist, a course where ball striking is a little bit more important than putting. But if you can be a specialist on either Bermuda or the bent Poa greens that you have out there, you're going to have a lot of success. So that's what I'm looking at there in terms of comp number 1. Number 2 is the Plantation course at Kapalua. So I mentioned before that you have a lot of elevation change here. We saw that with the hole-by-hole breakdown, but also you're dealing with a lot of undulation on the fairways, a lot of bunkering, a lot of just tricky creative shots that you have to hit around this venue. You have that same effect at Kapalua, another extremely lengthy golf course, much like what you're going to have here at the Wells Fargo. And though you do have Bermuda greens out there, they're just a different style of Bermuda. They don't have nearly as much grain out there at the Tournament of Champions. So I don't think that the putting numbers are really going to be that good in terms of the crossover, but the ball striking numbers are definitely something to take a look at. There's an art form to going out there and hitting the right club, particularly when you're a solid 1, maybe 2 clubs downhill, and vice versa when you're going uphill. So I'm taking a look at those stats. And lastly, you've got Augusta National Golf Club. So I mentioned the undulation with Augusta too. You're dealing with a lot of sloped fairways, Parkland style, relatively long. So Augusta's not a bomber's track because it's super long or because it's wide open, but still it favors the players that are relatively long off the tee. And we have seen a correlation over the years between the guys that have had success at the Tournament of Champions, Augusta National, and at Wells Fargo. That's something that we've pointed out at all 3 events for all these tournaments are even held in the past, in fact. So anytime we get to one of these tracks, I always love to pull stats from the track. So those are the 4 courses that I think are the most correlated there and that you can use for your analysis this week. That is all I've got for the course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and hit that like button, but also go ahead and comment down below who you think ends up winning the President's Cup. I think it's a gimme, right? The United States should run away with it, but I guess go ahead and maybe tell us how much you think they win by. But either way, guys, I appreciate you stopping by, enjoying the content. If you want to make sure you don't miss any of the stuff I'm posting in the future, whether it's my Draftkings picks, I do plenty of live streams as a preparation. In fact, we'll be doing one on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time, getting ready for the President's Cup. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. You won't miss anything. I do a lot of YouTube content for both golf and the NFL side. I cover Showdown there, the main slate, just a lot that you don't want to miss. So make sure you go ahead and do that too. But until next time, guys, best of luck with all of your lineups, any outright bets that you decide to go ahead and place this week, and let's get this cash.